The Chicago Imagists were a group of artists who practiced together and in association with each other throughout the 1960s, 70s and the early 80s. This is the first exhibition of the Imagists' work in the UK for 40 years. And whilst they've been very influential for a small group of artists, many people in Europe are not familiar with their work. At a time when a younger generation of artists are looking back to overlooked art histories, it feels like a really, really resonant moment to present an exhibition of these extraordinary artists' works.
The Imagists were a group who met and came out of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and over a period of around 7 or 8 years they came through that institution and worked with different really important educators and teachers, and came together and made this body of work which is really unlike anything else that was being seen across the rest of the country at the time. They were sandwiched on the east and west coast by artists making very different kinds of work, and they were very inspired by vernacular culture, by sideshows, by music, by the kind of underground in Chicago, by architecture, and they just found a very different visual language which they drew from each other, but also had very individual styles as well.
I think it's important to say that they never saw themselves as a group. And when we had conversations with them in Chicago, when we visited, they were really clear about that. So even though they were exhibiting together, notably at the Hyde Park Art Centre, which was run by this incredibly inspiring director, Don Baum, who really encouraged them to experiment, try new things, make often quite wild-looking exhibitions.
I think they really just looked to each other. They were really excited by each other's work, and you see that when they came together to make a publication for, I guess, the first group show, the defining one, which was the Hairy Who exhibition, where a group of the artists produced publications that they sold for a small amount of money to raise funds, but also it was a very early sort of marketing tool for an exhibition. But they're the very beautiful publications that we have in the exhibition.
All of these artists were working together with a real sense of freedom, partly because they were outside of the perceived centre, so because they weren't working in New York or LA, it seems like they could just take a bit more risk with their practice. I'm really interested to bring this exhibition to Bexhill because artists are trying to find ways of living and working outside of capital cities more and more. And in Sussex and along the south coast, there's been a great history of artist communities. So Charleston, Ditchling, for example, communities of artists who were developing their own language together in conversation with each other and being inspired by the place that they live. And that's happening more and more where we are now.
I think throughout the exhibition, Rosie's had a solid favourite work, but mine pretty much changes every week, every day. But I think I'd talk about Roger Brown's The Four Seasons, which was a benefit painting for the Hyde Park Art Centre. It's 4 buildings with the artists of the Chicago Imagists in the windows, but also their supporters, their collectors, curators, collaborators, directors of museums in Chicago, and some of the Imagists themselves dressed up in some of their outfits that they wore for promotional posters for previous exhibitions. So it's quite self-referential, but there's also a small Jim Nutt painting in one of the windows, which is actually in this exhibition. So that's a really lovely kind of cornerstone painting somehow of the whole show.
It also shows them having a party, and I think it shows how much fun they had and how the network of artists and collectors and gallerists were really socialising with each other and just creating a whole amazing scene. My favourite work is Karl Wirsum's Saw, Saw, Saw from 1966. It's been a solid favourite throughout the whole run. One of the great pleasures in this show is that there's a lot of humour. And while we were on our research trips in Chicago, there were several occasions where Sarah and I were in tears with laughter at some of the
not jet lag, just
puns,
pun-induced laughter.
Exactly. And Saw, Saw, Saw just makes me laugh every time I see it.
Throughout the works, you'll see moments where many of them are playing with the idea of the aperture and different levels of picture plane being very influenced by architecture and by theatre. There were points when they were very clearly looking at similar things, and sometimes they feel like very irreverent motifs and very irreverent ideas, or suddenly there'll be lots of hairstyles, or suddenly they'll be looking at shoes, or suddenly there'll be moments where just you can tell that through mutual appreciation of each other's work that they were having conversations, and that comes out visibly in the work. So hopefully you'll be able to pick those moments throughout the exhibition and really see where some of them have gone off and really found a different path, and when some of them are really still drawing from each other in a very literal sense, and sometimes just through the kind of ideas behind the work.